All right. So today we're going to be looking at the reforms that are put into place with the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s. Again, particularly looking at Britain, largely because Britain is obviously the place where the Industrial Revolution begins in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. And also, they're one of the first places that really respond to it in a very serious way. So we're going to be looking today at a couple of things about um, how the governments tried to reform, and then also one of the things I'm going to ask you later is sort of how to write your own reform bill and try and prevent the negative treatment of people as a result of that. So let's look then at sort of what's going on here. All right, so unions and laws are obviously unions, collective bargaining and trying to make the work conditions of people better is obviously a huge part of this. So one of the things that, we've seen this picture before is people during the Industrial Revolution had very tough working experiences. Their lives were very difficult. They worked in very, very grueling conditions, and people experienced, real social inequality. So let's review a little bit about what people used to work like before the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, most work was done in an agrarian fashion, right? People in um, worked on home farms, doing home production. It was very much a local type of workforce. However, in the 19th century, that changes into an industrial style, right? So when you're doing agricultural work, agrarian work, you're working for about 2/3 of the year, right? So around about March or so, you start making the fields ready for production. You start planting some of your crops. Then in the summer, May, June, July, August, you're tending those crops, weeding them, making sure that the crops are growing. And then from September really up until maybe November, early November, late October, you're harvesting those crops. But then from November to again about late February, March, you're not doing much. You're sort of preparing for the next season, maybe tending to your cows or your horses. You're mending the fences. You're mending the plows. You're doing things in preparation for that. So you really only have 2/3 of the year, really 8 months, I guess, of real diligent, productive work. When we get to the Industrial Revolution, that changes. Now you're doing work for 52 weeks a year. You don't get paid vacation. You don't get any vacation. You're working 6 days a week. So you're working, if you want to do the math on this, you certainly can. There's only 52 Sundays in a year. So you're only getting 52 days off a year. That's something to the tune of about, 360, 364 days in a year. You're working, 312 days a year. You're working an insane amount, but you're also working with no holidays, 14 hours a day, grueling work. So let's talk about the problems that working classes are experiencing. Factories are very dangerous places. You have huge machinery, big belts running around. You have big belts running around. You have big pieces of machinery. You have really awful conditions, bad lighting, um, machines belching smoke, no safety precautions, no job security. You could be fired one day just because the employer doesn't like you. You spoke up too much. The other part of this is children are working really, really tough jobs at very, very young ages. Children as young as the ages of 10, 8, 10, really once they were old enough to take instruction and once they were old enough to do manual labor, children did a lot of work. And they're working in some of the most terrible conditions, right? Because children are smaller than adults, they can fit into small spaces. So they can go into the middle of the machinery and pick things out, as I described in an earlier video. They can go up to the coal face and start moving the rocks away. Really, really dangerous stuff. Um, Also, children are less motivated to organize in the way that their parents would be. So it's across the board just a really tough situation for children. So reforms are needed in order to improve the lives of these people. Government, by the early 1800s, had not gotten involved with industry. The old sort of mercantile system had faded away. And because of mercantilism having faded away and those structures that were put in place had gone away, the um, the the capitalist model had taken hold. So governments were not in the position to criticize or put laws in place to stop these types of treatments of the younger people. And as a result, many of the wealthy who owned the factories really exploited the workers that they had. They treated them very, very harshly and very, very poorly. And this creates a system where people are in really tough positions. And as a result, you have the growth of unions. So unions are a collective, if you sort of think of guilds, right? So if you remember guilds, um, guilds were um, guilds were organizations that were put into place to work let's say, go for laborers to negotiate their own wages and protect their prosperity. Unions are sort of the follow up to that, still protecting the workers, but less on the sort of managerial side and more on the individual worker side. So unions pop up trying to argue for better lives for the people who are working. So in the 1830s, there are reform laws that make unions legal, and you are allowed then to collectively bargain, trying to seek laws that are making things better in work conditions and trying to get rid of long working hours. So this labor movement has some major events, right? So that there are major attempts at trying to stop or hurt factory owners. So you have an event in 1819 called the Peterloo Massacre, where the British cavalry charges on a group of workers who are trying to seek better reform, and a lot of people are hurt or killed during this. And this is one of the reasons why Britain has one of the major reform movements in the 1820s and 1830s, because there's a lot of workers who are collective, right? The British go through this earlier than anyone else. So there's a lot of workers around. You also have different laws that are coming in 1825. You have the repeal of a law that makes it illegal for unions to exist, so that there's now unions that are being permitted throughout this period. So what are some of the reform laws? All right, so Robert Peel is the prime minister in the early 1800s. There's a Factory Act that's put into place that says that children can't work in 1819, right? So you under the age of 9, so still quite young, but what's important to see here is you have laws that are being put in place to try and make the lives of people better. Then you have two other laws that come into place. Both of them are laws called the Factory Act, but the laws have different actions, right? So the first one, passed in 1833, again, targets children, right? So it's really easy to see that children are being taken advantage of, right? We all sort of can agree that children under the age of 9 should not be working. But it's also important to notice that people, even the factory owners and the government, is coming involved in saying that we can't have children doing this, right? Maybe it's because of innocence. Maybe it's because we just agree children should not be in dangerous conditions. They're not old enough to make those decisions for themselves. So it changes the work days, right? So children can only work 8 hours a day, down from 12. Um, they children under 13 must receive education. Now that's an important addition, right? That we are now requiring certain groups of people to be educated. That's really the first time in history we have had compulsory required education. So that's an important thing. It's small, right? It's only 2 hours per workday, but it's something. And then you have the Factory Act for textiles. This again reduces the amount of work that children can do, and then it says they must receive 3 hours of education. Again, nothing huge here, but it's something small that we're working towards. Again, you have small incremental changes that are happening here that are limiting the ability of people. Now, other parts of the world are not doing this quite as quickly. These are all in Britain. In other parts of the world, it's happening much later. So in the United States, you don't have these types of laws happening until the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and even into the early 1900s. In France, it's certainly later as well, 1840s and 50s and 60s. But again, Britain is earlier than everyone else, so it's not surprising to us that Britain has this happen earlier. So then what are the lasting effects? The lasting effects here are that you are seeing at least the beginning of a public education system. You're seeing a beginning of people advocating for the better education and better treatment of children. You're also having a system where unions become a political force. So unionism in Britain is something that is still quite large, although it's certainly weaker now in the 20th century, 20th and 21st century. But in the 1800s and early 1900s, unions had a lot of power in Britain, and that's largely due to these early successes. By the 1917, you have a massive strike by a group called the Trade Union Congress that is a huge political force, represents all of the unions in Britain, and starts to work towards better treatment of the people in factories. I want to go back up here just for a second. So this labor movement, I just want to talk one more minute here, right? One of the things that we've talked about in other portions is, capitalism, right? This idea, capitalism versus socialism. One of the things that's important to see here is this is the beginning of sort of a socialist kind of understanding, right? People within Britain are starting to see themselves as workers, right? Sort of what we call a class consciousness, a consciousness that we are the workers versus the owners, right? So Marx, and we'll talk a little bit about Marx next week, Marx sees this as a, as the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And that is something that's starting here, and that's what people are seeing. So when we see these working class ideas, right, and certainly when you have the experience of commonality, right? If I'm a worker, I can talk to people and say, "Oh, I am experiencing the same as you," and we can sort of see that as a way that we need to fight for our rights. I'm going to post another video in a moment just looking over the documents and things that we need to do for the next class. So you'll see that there's a couple of documents to read. And the final thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to write a workplace law about that is in response to the treatment of and the work for people. All right, guys, good luck.